So today we're doing the follow-up to the last video, Scientist Cradles Artist. This one is Artist Cradles Scientist, using the same characters that I developed in the first one, but playing it out a little bit farther and in the reverse. So let's get to it. So for this one, I was thinking of the same environment as I did the last, kind of a dorm room, while the characters remain pretty allegorical and fantastic. You can see that the drawing I'm using here is really all over the place. I'm thinking more about compositional forces, these large diagonals, larger verticals, large horizontals, and large curves. I know exactly the direction that my picture is taking. You're going to have these two characters embracing one another, one sort of slightly leaning over the other receiving the lift or receiving the embrace. In this case, the hands are shifting a little bit. I'm having to come up with the personality of the artist. And as I described in the last video, it's relatively non-specific. So there's definitely a female and a male character, but they're very racially non-specific. I think the age is pretty non-specific. The color can be all over the place. And so I'm really figuring out primarily what shape is going to lead this composition. So I'm doing the same kind of playfulness with the feet of the scientist in this case as I did with the feet of the artist last time, where she's embracing him, sort of pulling him up in a bear hug or an earth mother hug, and his legs are sort of thrown up to the side. Carving out these figures and their relationship, you can see that I'm really trying to find how is her hair placed, how is his head placed, what is the line between them. How to make that interesting, how to give that the appropriate amount of sentiment, but also formality and structure. And then at this point, dividing up each one of the characters. So the parts of their clothing, the parts of their bodies, how are all those relating? And intensifying, not losing some of that sense of the circle, that sense of the curve that is combining these characters together. At this point, really developing details and features, making sure that the characters in this one are at least reminiscent, if not identical, to the figures from the Scientist Cradles Artist painting that I did last time. And figuring out some of the elements of costuming. So we've got the scientist character who's wearing kind of basic scrubs. His shoes are sort of slippers. It's both comfortable and intense. There's a combination of the two. The style is somewhat realistic, but also quite stylized and cartoony. And so figuring out the foundation for that as I'm working through the sketch here. The nature of the contact between their hands is also really important. You can see that I'm really figuring out how is that going to work. We have the scientist's hands that I'm constantly shifting back and forth, extending and contracting, getting a sense of how they might pass through the artist character's hair. And her head was in constant shift. With the previous one, with the Scientist Cradles Artist, it was pretty direct. I found my character design sort of straight off. And with this one, it took a little bit of time, because I found that as I was elongating it, it became a little bit insectoid, a little bit robotic, a little bit feline at different times. And I wanted to humanize it without losing some of those interesting sort of secondary associations. So I kept, without erasing it entirely, I kept kind of pushing it into a human form. At this point, refining all of those details sort of at the same time. You can see that I'm running around the picture, finding how edges connect to each other, finding how these collections of features in the heads and in the bodies are developed. And finding those elements of weight, right? So we have one figure weighed against the other. One is embracing and holding the other. But also we have the hair of the primary figure, the artist figure, as it falls over the hand of the scientist figure. You can see that I'm trying to find how the hand there at the back of his shirt is working. Sort of the display of the fingers, how large are her eyes going to be, how strong is her mouth going to be. Some of these little details of inflection and curvature. We can see in his feet or in his slippers how they're pushing back and pushing forward a little bit to create that sense of, well, just pushing back rather, sort of rising up to create that sense of movement, of weight. and of anatomy. You can see that the finger on her right hand is sort of clinging at the collar of his shirt. I'm throwing in some of the elements from the previous picture and varying them in order to create sort of thematic interest. So with the idea that this is a dormitory, you have pictures in the background, and I actually, you'll see them as they're coming up, but I sort of fabricated some abstract paintings on Procreate, and I just ported them into this file. They'll come in. The outlet metaphor that I used in the previous one is there as well, so I know that that's going to be a little sort of symbol in miniature for these two characters, for the arts and for the sciences, as two power sources. So at this point, I've finalized my graphite drawing. I feel happy enough about it, and I'm throwing over these uniform lines, monoline in the calligraphy portion of Procreate. Getting all that set, you can see some final cleanup before I throw in colors. And color took me a long time for this one to really feel like I was doing something interesting or worthwhile. So you can see there I'm finalizing the little outlets, getting all of that totally done before I jump into final color touches. Getting the frames done in the background. We have the rings on her hands. And there we go. So throwing in a big blue mood color, very, very basic skin tone for both of the characters. Throwing in some purples, some light pinks. That's that painting that I was talking about, sort of an abstract to act as contrast. The kind of abstract that you might see in a hospital setting or that you might see in a dorm room or a university setting, making it sort of flat but also interesting, so it captures both. Figuring out sort of the character of her jewelry, of her costuming. You have that purple shirt with the black stripes, the rainbow colors of the jewelry on her hands. All of those came in as initial points of interest, and I find a way to keep myself consistently engaged in a picture is to set those up early on and then to move from there. So you can see at this point, I'm figuring out a little bit more of what distinguishes the flesh of the characters from the overall pattern and lighting of the surrounding areas. The hair, the clothing, all of that are set against this sort of light, pale pink representation of the two characters looking at each other. Playing a lot with different layers, using Procreate's resources here, figuring out what kind of lighting, what kind of color intensity and texture is going to be interesting. I wanted to keep it simple enough. You can see that I'm kind of throwing colors into black outlines. I wanted to keep it relatively graphic, but to give each of the colors their own life. And that subtle shift from one area of color to another area of color, or that subtle shift that occurs within a single area of color, is of kind of primary importance to me here. All right, so heading into a final here, finding that same kind of unifying pale light between the two characters. So you have this depth of color, which marks out the area underneath the two characters. Finalizing that depth of shadow, that intensity of color within each of the characters' heads and their bodies. Finding those neon sort of whites, blues and yellows around them. And then some final details. As you can see, there's a color disruption happening around his right hand as it's moving through her hair. There's some pixelation areas. There are some areas of sort of distortion and feedback, sort of color and detail feedback to make the picture a little more textured, and that's it. That sort of wraps it. So that completes that two-part series, Scientist Cradles Artist, and in this case, Artist Cradles Scientist. If you want to find more work, you want to see what I'm doing, you can follow me here on YouTube. You can find me at Miles Lewis Art on Instagram, mileslewisstudio.com, the website. And feel free to leave any comments, any questions below, and I look forward to chatting with you. See you next time.